Hello everyone, apologies for the rather utilitarian atmosphere in this classroom setting. I've tried a number of places around college more interesting than this, but none of them seem to have worked today. So here we are, stuck in this very white looking environment. Not to worry, I hope you will be able to still focus and engage in some of the ideas that I'm going to briefly sketch out for you. Really, this is just further to the videos, the films that I filmed for you back at the farm, and taking our reflections broader from Schweitzer into conversation with Hudson and with McKinley. So let's just get into it. I've got a coffee, so please feel that you have my blessing, not that you need it, to go and get a coffee now and settle in and enjoy as much as you can reflecting on these things. So the three readings with which we approach the question of what it means to offer spiritual care to those who live with various forms of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, all emphasise crucial elements of the situation of our critical reflection. Rosalie Hudson's approach is theological. It emphasises the essential personhood of every human on the basis of their relatedness to the divine, to God in Christian tradition. It is a powerful argument against the reductionism of utilitarian ethics that attempts to situate personhood in the functional usefulness of human beings to the greater society. So if you're no longer useful, if you're no longer able to contribute, then you become a burden to society, and it's probably better that we dispose of you. That's extreme utilitarian ethics. So Hudson's theological reflection is a powerful argument against utilitarian approaches. Elizabeth McKinley's approach I'm calling phenomenological, and it's more it's an approach that is more often found in secular environments such as public hospitals and so on. It emphasises the lived experience of the ageing person, seeks to describe it as we perceive it or as it is given to us in phenomenological terms, and then respond to what actually is happening and trying to free that from preconceptions that we often have about spirituality, which may be religious, they may be dualistic, there may be all kinds of preconceptions that we bring to our understanding of the spirituality of a person that are not appropriate. So this approach seeks, through qualitative and sometimes quantitative research, to actually describe what is real, what's actually happening, what this event, this phenomenological event, actually is in our perception. Albert Schweitzer's approach I've called physiological, mystical, ethical. It emphasises that spiritual life is inherent in our physiological structure and is therefore a pre-conscious element of our capacity to stay alive together. Ideas about spiritual care derived from Schweitzer's approach tend to value the full range of human senses in the synthesis of the human mind. Thus, the whole physiological human person is understood to be mind, conscious and otherwise, and it relies on all of its physiological systems to sense and interpret its environment and relationships. This can happen even in the absence of the consciousness of identity, memory, recognition, etc. And I hope you can hear why Schweitzer becomes so important for spiritual care in general, but in particular for spiritual care to those living organisms that do not necessarily demonstrate the same ways of being alive as the majority do. And something like a neurological disorder that interrupts memory and identity and so on can be seen to be a form of difference, a different expression of what it means to be the will to live, not necessarily a lesser expression, one that has certain limitations. But if we ditch all our preconceptions and our value judgments, then we may in fact be able to respond to this person as our equal, though different to us. Every now and again I'm just going to adjust this camera because it tends to slip. Grab gravity is a powerful force. Okay, let's go into a little bit more detail. Rosalie Hudson's approach I have called theological. Hudson is an experienced palliative care nurse educator and a theologian of some depth who takes the context within which theology is undertaken seriously. So, theology and theological reflection are never done in a sort of abstract environment, abstracted from the real world. The questions of actual existence need to be taken into account. They need to be brought into the theological conversation, as it were. Now, taking the context seriously may not seem all that ingenious to those of us who don't habitually walk the hallowed halls of theological education institutions. Taking the context seriously is something we do every day. But whether or not we should take it seriously has filled books and lecture halls for over 100 years now in the debate over the course of modern and postmodern theology. You see, the problem for theology is that context is messy, it changes, and it's complex, tangled, if you like. It changes and shifts, it challenges neatly held theories and breaks systems that are supposed to explain everything. Australian theologian Graham Garrett has used the metaphor of mountaintops and forest gullies to highlight the difference. Grand systems of thought, lists of tasks, and meta-narrative explanations of the meaning of everything all belong to the mountaintops. They claim to be able to see a long way, to cover a great distance, to be clear of the messiness of the valleys, the context. Up there is at least the illusion of far sight, clear air, clarity and a clear view all the way to the horizon. The great systems of theological and philosophical thought that characterised the last 2 centuries considered themselves to be offering human society a grand vision of what it means to be alive in the world that encapsulates everything. But then there is the descent that theology makes into the forest gullies, the valleys between the mountaintops, those dark and tangled places, so full of countless varieties of life that it is easy to lose your way. We can't see well down here, and it can be hard to plot a clear course. Things change all the time, and so what we thought was a clear way forward is no longer there. These tangled gullies are just like life in the ordinary sense that we experience from day to day. Most of us live from moment to moment deeply in the forest of the valleys and gullies of the world. There is nothing like raw human experience for messing up a grand meta-narrative or a fine theological theory. Human beings, I've always maintained, are the greatest interruption to our theology. I think that you will agree from your reading that Rosalie Hudson is searching for a theology of the forest gullies. She wants to take the human person, and not just any human person, a complex, limited human person, and do theology in the midst of what it means to be a human person living with different cognitive abilities. Yet, in my view, Hudson is not presenting theology with what we often think of as a fully functional, healthy human person. She's presenting theology with a person who has very little in the way of reflective cognitive ability, a person who no longer knows what it is to intentionally reflect upon questions of identity, meaning and relationship. You can hear I stuffed up my reading just there. I've just repeated myself in that sense, but it's an important point that the human person that is the subject in this theological conversation is a complex, messy thing that does not fit easily into meta-narratives. People who live with dementia, people like this who don't fulfil what we seem to think a human being should be, kind of throw a spanner in the works of our fine theories about what it means to live and to be living a healthy life. Hudson attempts to reach into the historical Christian thinking about the person as valuable on the basis of its relatedness to divine life. So that's a central point to her theology. Our relationship to God determines our personhood. In her theological reflection, we receive a sense of the human person as intrinsically valuable because the essence of the being comes to them as a gift from another place, from another person, in fact, the divine, living person. Every step of the way through her paper, Hudson describes the human person as a recipient of their intrinsic value from a source other than themselves. She calls it grace. The divine is that source. From her first use of Lossky's equation of the theologian as someone who does not search for God but is seized by God, through to her equating personhood with being itself, hypostasis, rather than with the concrete attributes of existing human beings, Hudson is seeking to divorce humanness as an essence from humanness as actual expressed event in existence. I think we can understand why. When, as in the case of the various forms of dementia, our actual existing human faculties begin to fail us, we might naturally look around for somewhere else to situate what we think of as the core of our sense of self and identity, because this is becoming complex, problematic, and different. After all, so many people consider the limitations of dementia to be a virtual end of existence that it is natural for even the theologians of the Tangled Gullies to want to situate the core of human personhood in a place other than the fast-failing physicality of the aged person with dementia. Far better, surely, if my personhood, the core of my identity, is in a sense held in trust for me in another place in the life of God, so that when this particular expression of it fails, the truest essence of myself continues in God. It's a nice idea. It's one that has its appeal to us, one that no doubt has helped us draw close to the questions of loss of faculty and loss of life without panicking. In doing so, Hudson, though she begins by wandering down into the Tangled Gullies and asking the question of personhood without shying away from the real human person with dementia, ultimately looks longingly back up to the mountaintops, I argue, for an answer to the complexity encountered in the reality of the person living with dementia. It is to our completion in death that Hudson looks for the ultimate affirmation of human personhood. Death, for Hudson, does not negate personhood. It fulfills it in perfect communion with the divine Trinitarian life. Just let me straighten you up there a bit. You're slipping again. As we lose our concrete expression as existing beings, physiological organisms, the essence of our personhood in relationship with God is, in Hudson's view, ultimately fulfilled. She certainly doesn't argue this in order to justify or hasten death in any way, only to seek to place value in what is a natural progression of human life through the stages of complex change and decline, and then ultimately dissipation in death. The short way of saying, really, what she is saying is, don't worry, we are all going to heaven. And Hudson expresses that openly in her conclusion when she asks, perhaps it is to heaven that we should look. to the risen and ascended man who alone knows where any of us is at, and in that knowing stands beside us in all the frailty of our forgetfulness. It's a comforting thought, and might be sufficient for those who situate the essence of their personhood in a different reality beyond this one, which is a common religious perspective. Yet many people, even some who hold deep religious faiths, do not take comfort in looking beyond what is really part of their lived experience for some kind of spiritual hold, in a sense, on their own personhood and identity. The theology of Rosalie Hudson is ultimately not sufficient, I think, to answer the question of so many: why can't I just be me and be valuable because I am me here? This is me. Philosopher Raymond Gator asserts that the idea that we are intrinsically valuable because we are all children of God is always logically preceded by its necessary precursor: we are intrinsically valuable because we are all human beings. Implicit in this argument is the notion that, in fact, the essence of human personhood is not first known in relation to a divine other, but in relation to common humanity. Before I move on, I should highlight two aspects of Hudson's article that I've found to be profoundly important for our understanding of spiritual care in this context. Firstly, the call to be aware of the insidious trap of behaving towards the afflicted as if they exist only so that we can bestow our compassion upon them. What a devastating thought and warning in that sense. Christopher Hitchens, the great atheist, late atheist, alluded to this danger in The Compassionate Attitude when he wrote, "Distrust compassion. Prefer dignity for yourself and others." Compassion without dignity is condescension. It is like love without justice. It is the opposite of deep and true listening, which is the core of spiritual care. So I'm grateful, deeply grateful to Rosalie Hudson for highlighting that great risk in the way we approach people who we may misconceive to be lesser than we are on the basis of their physiological condition. The second thing that I really value about Hudson's article is that she emphasises the inherent relatedness and what I call the irreducibility of human persons. She emphasises that human persons are complex, intersubjective, relational beings, and their identities are formed in relationship, which makes them irreducible. You can't reduce a human being to this function or that value or this religion or that race. Or human beings don't easily reduce to those kinds of simplistic categories. So I really value this about Hudson's paper. Spiritual care occurs in between people, and that's what we mean when we speak about transcendence. It occurs in between us as we discover our common humanity and mutual dignity in intersubjective relating, when both of us come with mutuality into the listening space. So, Rosalie Hudson's article, a great invitation into the conversation. Elizabeth McKinlay's approach is common to ideas about spiritual care that are developing in the public sphere, particularly in health and aged care. This view of spirituality is more inclusive generally and based on phenomenological rather than theological ways of seeing human beings. When I say phenomenological, I mean seeking to describe the spirituality of the human person as it is, or as it presents itself to me, without my preconceptions about what spirituality is. So I need to put in brackets my perhaps religious understanding of spirituality or whatever, in order to seek to truly describe what is in front of me, what's happening in this interaction. The phenomenological approach is by definition inclusive. It describes what is in every human experience, or seeks to describe. It does not place value judgments based on preconceived ideas of spirituality, such as religion and dualistic understandings of reality. It tends to be more outcome-driven because it wants to describe the phenomenon. What happens when you apply spiritual care principles? Do people get better? Do people feel well? What happens? What does it mean to create an environment in which a person might make meaning, and what does that look like? That's a very phenomenological approach. So these sorts of approaches often involve themselves in quantitative and qualitative research in order to actually get a look at what's going on and describe it. I think her approach falls short, however, of a complete phenomenological approach in that it describes the spiritual experience of the older person in terms of tasks, giving it what I call a teleological element. Telos means aim, a sort of inner meaningful purpose towards which all experiences are building towards some kind of ultimate evolution or ultimate culmination or fulfillment of what it means to be human. It's a great idea, and it's an idea that's in most of our human thought these days, but I don't think it's necessarily helpful, and it's certainly not phenomenological in that sense. It doesn't. It brings a preconceived idea about events, people, happenings, as we perceive them, as they present themselves to us. It's something that really needs to be bracketed away for a while we actually ask what's going on now in the present. What's the meaning of what's happening here now? Not what is its meaning for the ultimate fulfillment somewhere else at the end. And I think McKinlay slips slightly into the trap of what's this all for? What's it moving towards? What's its ultimate meaning in the end, rather than what's happening right now in the immediate present. McKinlay describes dementia as both a physiological disease and a culturally defined disease. The disease, as it presents itself to us, is multifaceted, both culturally and physiologically, and both of these elements contribute to the spirituality of dementia. Using Frankel's method of positive decision to make meaning in the situation as it presents itself to us, McKinlay shifts the focus from what dementia prevents you from doing to what is possible for you as someone living with dementia. As such, the opportunities of group work and narrative therapy do present themselves as possible conduits for spiritual care. It's a very positive, empowering, listening model of approaching the human person. And it does not preconceive what spiritual means necessarily in each individual human event. So that's McKinlay, also bringing a valuable approach for us. The work of Albert Schweitzer that we've reflected on in the videos that preceded this one undergirds and is prior to both of these approaches. And when I say prior to, I mean that the others cannot be without this one being first. Or first being, depends how you want to put it. It is itself almost purely phenomenological, this approach. It seeks to see the world and life as it is given to us and without religious teleological understandings. Both the theological approach of Hudson and the phenomenological approach of McKinlay rely on the knowledge that spirit is what we are and how we live before we are even aware that religious questions are a thing or that philosophical approaches might help us explain ourselves. The simple universal principle that biological life is organically infused with an irreducible will to live that recognises that its life is reliant upon a pre-conscious reverence for life and that is evolved to know, understand and reflect upon itself, underlies all attempts to care for, to show compassion towards, and to recognise the dignity in our living relations with each other and our environment. The implications of understanding that spirituality is part of our cellular biological structure has significant implications for the way we approach spiritual care in situations of dementia. I'm going to read that again. That was a weird sentence that I mucked up. Understanding that spirituality is part of our cellular biological structure has significant implications for the way we approach spiritual care in situations of dementia. I hope that was a little bit more coherent. Multiple approaches to spiritual care with people living with dementia are appropriate. Adapted forms of narrative approach, such as McKinley's method, religious patterns, music, touch, deep, unhurried presence, and attention to the present moment. All of these approaches can draw on elements of spirit in the person that do not require linear memory, retention of facts or short-term memory, reflective capacity, or conscious sense of identity. They can offer spiritual care because they recognise spirit in the very cellular, pre-conscious will to live that is presented to them in the living organism that they are listening to. This is demonstrated in some of the YouTube videos. That organism's spirituality does not need narrative, doesn't need memory in the terms of our cognitive linear memory, or even a sense of identity, ego, in order to derive meaning from immediate interaction with the environment, which includes human relationship. I can make meaning and derive meaning from the simple touch of a flower or another person. I can derive and make meaning in the immediate present by eating, by breathing, by being alive, by sharing, by listening to music that evokes memories that are embodied within me in different ways, not just my brain. Our bodies are minds, and so every cell, every element of our physiological organism participates in our spirituality. And so any form of care that engages the human person as mind in all of their presence is spiritual and appropriate, particularly for those who live with dementia. In this way, we can begin to see people living with dementia not as somehow lesser than us, but as complex, different physiological organisms that cannot relate in the ways that they used to, or in the ways that most of us relate most days. That does not in any way mean that they are less human, nor less alive, and therefore less spiritual. They are profoundly spiritual. Even someone who cannot remember that they've ever read the Bible, they cannot even remember to ask who God is, or where God is, or what God means. None of that precludes them from a strong, healthy, faithful spirituality at the core of who they are as living human organisms. And because we are all interrelated, we can carry the depth and meaning of a person's life between us in that sense. I really hope that these short reflections have increased and furthered your capacity to ask your own questions in response to the readings. I hope you're enjoying them, and I look forward to your reading reports after the non-teaching break. See you next time.